Colonel Marcus Kane had spent 15 years making Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez's life a living hell, crushing her spirit with daily humiliations and career sabotage. He never imagined that one day she would walk into his office wearing stars on her shoulders and the authority to end his military career with a single word: the fluorescent lights of the Veterans Affairs Regional Office in Phoenix cast harsh shadows across rows of metal desks where caseworkers processed disability claims with mechanical efficiency. In the furthest corner, almost hidden behind towering stacks of manila folders, sat Elena Vasquez. Her small cubicle was wedged between a broken photocopier and a water-stained wall, the kind of workspace reserved for employees management hoped would quietly disappear. Elena's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced precision, entering data from medical records into the VA's outdated computer system. Case after case, veteran after veteran, each file representing someone who had served their country and now waited months for disability benefits that might never come. She wore a faded blue cardigan over a simple white blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had gone unchanged for the 3 years she'd worked at this desk. The morning routine never varied. Elena arrived at 7:30, a full hour before her supervisor, and worked through lunch while her colleagues gathered in the break room to complain about their caseloads. She kept her head down, spoke only when spoken to, and processed twice as many claims as anyone else in the department. To her co-workers, she was furniture. Reliable, unremarkable furniture that required no maintenance or attention. "Vasquez, these Morrison files need to be reprocessed," barked Janet Curtis, the department supervisor, dropping a stack of folders onto Elena's already cluttered desk without making eye contact. "The medical examiner wants additional documentation before we can approve the PTSD claim." Elena looked up briefly, noting the dismissive tone that had become as familiar as her morning coffee. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have them completed by end of business today." Curtis was already walking away, her attention focused on more important matters. Elena had learned years ago that enthusiasm or suggestions were met with annoyance, so she simply returned to her work. The Morrison case was complex, involving a Marine who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and was now homeless, living in his car while waiting for benefits. Elena had read his file dozens of times, memorizing every detail of his service record and medical history through the thin cubicle walls. She could hear her colleagues discussing weekend plans and office gossip. Linda from Intake was planning a birthday party for her daughter. Mike from Appeals was complaining about his ex-wife's alimony demands. Elena listened to their conversations like background noise, occasionally glancing at the small American flag pin on her desk, the only personal item in her sterile workspace. The phone rang constantly, but Elena's direct line rarely lit up. Veterans called the main number, spoke to intake specialists, and were funneled through a bureaucratic maze that kept them far from the people who actually processed their claims. Elena preferred it that way. Phone calls meant questions she couldn't answer honestly, explanations about delays she had no power to prevent, and conversations that reminded her why she'd chosen this quiet corner of government service. At exactly noon, Elena unwrapped a peanut butter sandwich she'd brought from home and continued working while eating. She'd learned to accomplish more during lunch hour when the office was quiet and the phone stopped ringing. Her supervisor had commented once that Elena seemed unnaturally dedicated to her work, as if caring about veterans' benefits was somehow suspicious. The afternoon brought a steady stream of urgent requests from various departments. Elena handled each with the same methodical approach, never missing deadlines, never requiring clarification, never causing problems for anyone above her pay grade. She'd perfected the art of professional invisibility, completing her assignments so efficiently that her superiors could focus on more complex matters without worrying about her workload. As closing time approached, Elena began organizing her desk for the next day. Each stack of files was arranged by priority, her computer screen displaying a spreadsheet that tracked her progress on dozens of cases. The Morrison file sat prominently in her urgent pile, flagged for additional review. She'd noticed discrepancies in his medical evaluation that suggested his disability rating should be higher, but pointing out such details had gotten her in trouble before. The office emptied quickly at 5 o'clock, her colleagues eager to start their weekends. Elena remained at her desk, finishing the Morrison documentation and preparing Monday's workflow. The janitor arrived around 6, nodding politely as he emptied her wastebasket. She was usually the last person in the building, excluding security. Guards who barely acknowledged her existence. Elena finally gathered her purse and cardigan, taking one last look at her organized desk before heading toward the exit. Tomorrow would bring another stack of files, another day of processing claims for veterans who deserved better than a broken system that treated their service like paperwork to be filed and forgotten. In the parking lot, Elena's 15-year-old Honda sat alone under a broken streetlight. As she drove home through Phoenix traffic, she passed recruitment billboards and military surplus stores, reminders of a world that felt increasingly distant from her current reality. Her small apartment awaited, along with a microwave dinner and evening news that rarely mentioned veterans unless something had gone terribly wrong. Elena Vasquez had found her place in the shadows, processing other people's military service from behind a desk where no one expected anything remarkable. She'd learned to be satisfied with small victories and invisible contributions, never imagining that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to be shattered by a crisis that would force her back into the spotlight. She'd spent years avoiding, preparing, and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Monday morning arrived with the familiar buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of copy machines warming up for another week of bureaucratic processing. Elena settled into her cubicle with practiced efficiency, but today brought an unexpected disruption to her carefully ordered routine. Regional Director Patricia Hammond stood near the reception desk, her sharp business suit and authoritative posture commanding immediate attention from the entire staff. "I want to see improved processing times on disability claims," Hammond announced to the assembled caseworkers. "Washington is breathing down our necks about the backlog, and this office's numbers are falling behind national averages." Her eyes swept across the room, briefly pausing on Elena's corner before moving on as if she were part of the furniture. Janet Curtis immediately stepped forward, eager to demonstrate her management capabilities. "Director Hammond, we've been implementing new efficiency protocols. Some of our workers have been suggesting additional documentation requirements that are actually slowing down approvals." Curtis's meaningful glance toward Elena's cubicle made the implication clear. Elena continued typing, her fingers steady on the keyboard, despite the familiar sting of being blamed for problems she was trying to solve. Last month, she'd submitted a memo explaining how incomplete medical evaluations were causing delays, suggesting that better communication with examining physicians could expedite the entire process. Curtis had dismissed the suggestion as overstepping boundaries and filed the memo in what Elena suspected was a trash can. "The Morrison case is a perfect example," Curtis continued, warming to her theme. "Our processor has been requesting additional documentation that's unnecessary for approval. These veterans need benefits, not bureaucratic delays." Elena's jaw tightened slightly as she recognized her meticulous work on the homeless Marines file being characterized as obstructionist. Director Hammond nodded approvingly. "I want to see more decisive action. These veterans have waited long. Enough." She moved through the office like a general inspecting troops, pausing at various desks to review case files and ask pointed questions about processing times. When Hammond reached Elena's cubicle, she barely glanced at the organized stacks of completed files or the detailed spreadsheet tracking case progress. Instead, she picked up the Morrison folder, scanning Elena's handwritten notes about potential medical discrepancies. "This level of detail seems excessive," Hammond observed. "Are you a medical doctor, Miss Vasquez?" "No, ma'am," Elena replied quietly. "I'm just noting inconsistencies between the examination report and the Veterans Service medical records." "Let the medical professionals handle medical evaluations," Hammond said dismissively. "Your job is data entry, not diagnosis." She handed the file to Curtis. "Process this claim immediately. No more delays." Elena watched the Morrison file disappear, knowing that the Marine would receive a lower disability rating than his injuries warranted. She'd seen his x-rays, read his deployment medical logs, and understood the progression of traumatic brain injuries better than most examining physicians. But pointing out her qualifications would only invite questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Throughout the week, the pattern continued. Elena's suggestions for streamlining the appeals process were dismissed as too complicated by supervisors who hadn't read past the first paragraph. Her identification of fraudulent claims was ignored, because investigating fraud took time away from processing approvals. When she quietly corrected errors in other caseworkers' files, her corrections were attributed to luck or excessive attention to detail. During Thursday's staff meeting, Elena sat in the back row while Curtis presented statistics showing improved processing times. The improvement came largely from Elena's increased workload and efficiency improvements, but Curtis carefully avoided mentioning specific contributors. "Team effort," Curtis emphasized, using the collective pronoun while making eye contact with everyone except Elena. "Vasquez," Curtis called out suddenly, "you've been working here 3 years. Do you have any suggestions for improving our operations?" The question was clearly rhetorical, designed to demonstrate inclusive leadership rather than seek genuine input. Elena looked around the room at her colleagues' expectant faces. She could discuss tactical communication protocols that would reduce information requests by 40%. She could explain how cross-referencing deployment medical records with civilian treatment history would expedite psychological evaluations. She could outline resource allocation strategies that would eliminate the current backlog within 6 months. Instead, she said, "I think we're doing good work. Maybe we could use better computers." Light laughter rippled through the room. Curtis smiled patronizingly. "Technology improvements are above our pay grade, but I'll pass that suggestion up the chain." Elena's technical expertise in systems integration remained safely hidden behind a request for newer monitors. The meeting concluded with assignments for increased processing quotas. Elena would handle the most complex cases because she seemed to enjoy detail work, while her colleagues received straightforward approvals that boosted their statistics. The distribution was presented as playing to everyone's strengths, but Elena recognized it as punishment disguised as responsibility. After work, Elena drove past the Veterans Center downtown, watching homeless men gather around a soup kitchen. She wondered if Morrison had received his denial letter yet, if he was still sleeping in his car while waiting for benefits that would help him afford basic housing. Her training in veteran psychology told her he was at high risk for suicide, but her position as a data entry clerk meant her concerns would be dismissed as speculation. Elena had learned to swallow her expertise, to accept that her knowledge was unwelcome in an environment that valued compliance over competence. 3 years of careful invisibility had taught her that speaking up only invited scrutiny, and scrutiny led to questions about backgrounds better left unexplored. She'd found safety in mediocrity, protection in being underestimated, but safety came at a cost, and Elena was beginning to realize that some prices were too high to pay indefinitely. Elena's routine was interrupted Friday morning by an urgent case that landed on her desk with a red priority sticker. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres had been found unconscious in a grocery store parking lot. Rushed to the emergency room with what doctors initially diagnosed as a heart attack. The hospital needed immediate verification of his VA medical coverage before proceeding with expensive cardiac procedures. Elena opened Torres's file and immediately noticed something others had missed. His deployment history showed 3 tours in Iraq with repeated exposure to burn pits, where military bases disposed of waste by burning everything from plastics to medical supplies in open-air fires. The toxic smoke had been linked to respiratory and cardiac issues, but the connection required specific medical knowledge that most caseworkers lacked. "This isn't a heart attack," Elena murmured to herself, scrolling through Torres's service medical records. She recognized the progression pattern from her experience with similar cases in deployed medical units. The symptoms described in the emergency room report matched chronic beryllium disease, a lung condition caused by inhaling metal particles from burn pit smoke. Elena reached for her phone to call the hospital, then hesitated. Her job was to verify coverage, not provide medical interpretations. But Torres was about to undergo unnecessary cardiac procedures while his actual condition went untreated. She dialed the hospital's patient advocate office, choosing her words carefully. "This is Elena Vasquez from the VA regional office. I'm processing coverage verification for Sergeant Torres. I wanted to note that his service records indicate significant burn pit exposure during deployment. You might want to include pulmonary specialists in his evaluation." The advocate paused, clearly surprised by the detailed suggestion. "Are you a medical professional?" "I process veteran medical claims," Elena replied diplomatically. "Burn pit exposure patterns are documented in many of our files." After hanging up, Elena noticed her cubicle neighbor, David Chun, watching her with curious interest. David had worked appeals for 5 years and was known for his attention to detail, but he'd never heard a caseworker provide clinical insights to medical professionals. "How did you know about burn pits?" David asked quietly. "I've been processing claims for years and never heard of beryllium disease." Elena's response was carefully neutral. "You pick up medical terminology after reading enough files." She turned back to her computer, but David's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation. Later that afternoon, Elena was reviewing a claim from Marine Corps veteran Lisa Rodriguez, who was seeking benefits for PTSD following a convoy attack in Afghanistan. The psychiatrist's evaluation seemed thorough, but Elena noticed critical gaps in the assessment. The attack occurred during a specific operation in Helmand Province, and Elena recognized the location from intelligence briefings she'd received during her own deployment. The psychiatrist had focused on direct combat trauma, but missed the survivor guilt component that was particularly severe in veterans who'd lost squad members to IEDs in that region. Elena had seen identical psychological profiles dozens of times, and she knew Rodriguez would need specialized treatment protocols that weren't mentioned in the evaluation. Elena crafted a careful email to the examining psychiatrist, suggesting additional assessment areas without revealing how she possessed such specific knowledge. She framed her suggestions as patterns observed in similar cases and documentation requirements for comprehensive evaluation. The psychiatrist responded within hours, thanking her for the insights and requesting copies of the similar cases she'd referenced. David Chun appeared at her cubicle again as Elena compiled response materials. "Rodriguez's case got fast-tracked for specialized treatment," he observed. "The psychiatrist said your recommendations were unusually sophisticated for a caseworker." Elena continued typing without looking up. "Experience helps you recognize patterns." "What kind of experience?" David pressed gently. "I mean, you seem to understand these deployment scenarios better than most VA counselors." Elena finally met his eyes, her expression carefully composed. "I read a lot of military history. Books, documentaries, veteran interviews. You develop perspective after processing thousands of claims." David nodded slowly, but Elena could see he wasn't entirely satisfied with her explanation. Her knowledge was too specific, too nuanced for someone who'd learned about military service secondhand. She'd have to be more careful about revealing expertise that couldn't be explained by her current position. The following week brought Elena into contact with James Patterson, a Vietnam veteran applying for Agent Orange benefits. His medical records were incomplete, missing crucial documentation from his service in Da Nang Air Base. Elena recognized the base designation immediately and understood the specific chemical exposure risks associated with aircraft maintenance operations there. Elena located Patterson's missing service records using search techniques that impressed even the veteran service representatives who regularly worked with military archives. Her knowledge of military organizational structures and record-keeping systems enabled her to track down documentation that had been misfiled for decades. "You're remarkably efficient at navigating military bureaucracy," commented Sarah Walsh, a veteran service officer who'd collaborated with Elena on the Patterson case. "Most people get lost in the military filing systems, but you seem to understand exactly how they're organized." Elena smiled diplomatically. "The VA training programs are quite thorough." But Walsh's expression suggested skepticism. Elena's familiarity with military protocols extended far beyond what any civilian training program would provide. She moved through veteran affairs systems with the confidence of someone who'd navigated military bureaucracy from the inside, not someone who'd learned about it in orientation sessions. Elena was beginning to realize that her expertise was becoming harder to conceal. Each successful case resolution added another curious observer to her growing list of colleagues, who wondered how a quiet caseworker possessed such sophisticated understanding of military service and veteran affairs. Tuesday mornings shattered Elena's carefully maintained routine when emergency sirens began wailing across the Phoenix V, a medical center complex. Through her office window, she watched ambulances racing toward the main hospital building while security personnel evacuated nearby structures. The intercom crackled with terse announcements about a chemical exposure incident in the psychiatric wing. Elena's blood ran cold. The psychiatric ward housed vulnerable veterans receiving treatment for PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and substance abuse disorders. Many were former special operations personnel who'd been exposed to experimental chemicals during classified missions. If someone had released an unknown substance in that environment, the consequences could be catastrophic. Janet Curtis burst into the main office area, her usual composure replaced by obvious panic. "Everyone stay calm," she announced, though her voice suggested anything but calm. "The medical center is handling a minor chemical spill. We're to remain in the building, but avoid the West Wing until further notice." Elena stood up abruptly, recognizing details that Curtis had missed or didn't understand. The evacuation pattern visible through her window wasn't consistent with a minor spill. Emergency responders were setting up decontamination stations and establishing a perimeter that suggested serious chemical contamination. More concerning, she could see hazmat teams approaching the psychiatric building, indicating potential exposure to substances requiring specialized protective equipment. "This isn't a minor spill," Elena said, her voice cutting through the nervous chatter of her colleagues. "Look at the response pattern. They're treating this as a major hazmat incident." Curtis turned toward Elena with irritation. "The medical center administration knows how to handle their own emergencies. Your job is processing claims, not emergency management." Elena moved toward the window, studying the organized chaos below. She recognized the deployment pattern of first responders, the systematic approach to containment and evacuation that indicated training for chemical warfare scenarios. More troubling, she could see military vehicles arriving, suggesting federal involvement in what should have been a local hospital incident. "Those are Army Chemical Corps' vehicles," Elena observed, pointing toward the convoy approaching the medical center. "They don't deploy for cleaning supply spills." David Chun joined her at the window, squinting at the vehicles below. "How do you know those are chemical cores? They look like regular army trucks to me." Elena realized she'd revealed knowledge that civilian employees shouldn't possess. But the developing crisis left no time for careful concealment. The specialized equipment configuration. Those are mobile decontamination units used for chemical weapons exposure. "Chemical weapons?" Curtis snapped. "That's ridiculous. This is a VA hospital, not a battlefield." Elena's training kicked in as she analyzed the situation developing below. The psychiatric ward housed dozens of veterans who'd participated in classified programs, including experimental drug trials and exposure studies that remained secret decades later. If someone had accessed those medical records and targeted specific patients with agents designed to interact with their previous exposures, the results could be devastating. "We need to evacuate," Elena said firmly, her voice carrying an authority. That surprised her colleagues. If they're deploying chemical cores assets, the contamination risk extends beyond the immediate exposure area. Curtis stepped between Elena and the window, her face flushed with anger. "You're a GS7 clerk, not an emergency coordinator. Sit down and let qualified people handle this situation." Through the window, Elena watched hazmat teams entering the psychiatric building while medical personnel loaded patients onto specialized transport vehicles. She recognized the loading procedures from her experience with chemical casualty evacuations, noting details that confirmed her worst fears about the severity of the situation. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Chemical exposure targeting Ward 7B patients. Multiple casualties. Need immediate evacuation of adjacent buildings. Contamination spreading through ventilation systems." Elena stared at the message, recognizing the communication style and tactical assessment format she'd used countless times during her military service. Someone with operational knowledge was providing intelligence about the developing crisis, and they'd specifically contacted her. "The ventilation systems," Elena said urgently. "If contamination is spreading through the HVAC, this entire complex needs immediate evacuation." Curtis grabbed Elena's arm. "Stop creating panic. The medical center would notify us if evacuation was necessary." Elena looked around the office at her colleagues, who were watching the emergency response with growing concern, but no real understanding of what they were witnessing. These people trusted the chain of command, believed that proper authorities would protect them from dangers they couldn't identify or understand. Elena pulled out her personal cell phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. "This is Vasquez," she said when the call connected. "I need an immediate threat assessment for the Phoenix VA complex. Chemical contamination in Ward 7B with potential HVAC distribution." Curtis stared at Elena in shock as she listened to the response, her face growing pale. "Copy that. Initiating emergency protocols now." Elena ended the call and looked around the office with newfound authority. "Everyone needs to evacuate immediately. Move to the parking structure and await further instructions. This is not a request." Curtis stepped forward aggressively. "You have no authority to order evacuations. I'm calling security to have you removed from the building." Elena met Curtis's eyes with steady confidence. "Call them. But first, look outside and tell me if you want to explain to those families why you kept federal employees in a contaminated building because you were more concerned about hierarchy than safety." The choice was clear, and Elena was done hiding behind a desk while people she could protect faced dangers they couldn't recognize. Elena's attempt to coordinate evacuation was immediately interrupted by Director Hammond's arrival from the regional headquarters. Hammond strode into the office with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling situations through administrative authority, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Elena with obvious displeasure. "Miss Vasquez, I understand you've been making unauthorized phone calls and attempting to override established emergency protocols." Hammond said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of bureaucratic disapproval. "Sit down immediately and cease all unauthorized communications." Elena remained standing, her attention divided between Hammond's demands and the deteriorating situation, visible through the office windows. More emergency vehicles had arrived, including mobile command units. That indicated federal coordination of the response. She could see personnel in full chemical protective suits moving between buildings, their systematic approach suggesting contamination levels far beyond anything the regional staff had been told. "Director Hammond, the contamination is spreading beyond the initial exposure site," Elena said, keeping her voice level despite growing urgency. "The emergency response pattern indicates airborne chemical agents that require immediate evacuation of this facility." Hammond's expression hardened. "Your job is processing disability claims, not interpreting emergency response operations. The Medical Center Administration has informed us that the situation is contained and poses no threat to surrounding buildings." Elena looked toward Curtis, who was nodding in agreement with Hammond's assessment. Neither woman possessed the training to recognize the tactical deployment patterns or understand the implications of specialized equipment being used by the response teams. Their confidence came from faith in institutional communication channels that were clearly providing incomplete or inaccurate information. "The Chemical Corps' units wouldn't be deployed for a contained situation," Elena pressed. "Those mobile decontamination stations are designed for large-scale exposure incidents. If they're setting up multiple stations, contamination has spread beyond the psychiatric ward." Hammond stepped closer to Elena, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You seem remarkably knowledgeable about military operations for a civilian employee. Perhaps we should discuss how you acquired such specialized knowledge during your next performance review." The implied threat was clear, but Elena's concern for her colleague's safety outweighed her fear of career consequences. She pulled out her phone again, intending to contact someone with actual authority to override local administrative decisions. Curtis immediately intervened, grabbing Elena's wrist. "Put that phone away. You're creating unnecessary panic and undermining legitimate authority. If you don't stop this disruptive behavior immediately, I'll have security escort you from the building." Elena looked around the office at her colleagues, who were watching the confrontation with obvious discomfort. David Chun appeared torn between supporting Elena's concerns and maintaining his relationship with supervisors. Linda from intake kept glancing nervously between the windows and the arguing administrators. Mike from appeals was backing away from the conflict, clearly unwilling to choose sides in a dispute that could affect his career. "Look outside," Elena said, addressing the entire room rather than just Hammond and Curtis. "Count the response vehicles, look at the equipment configurations. This isn't a minor chemical spill that's been contained." Hammond followed Elena's gesture toward the window, then turned back with dismissive confidence. "Emergency response operations always appear overwhelming to untrained observers. The medical center would never endanger surrounding facilities by failing to communicate serious threats." Elena's phone buzzed with another message. "Contamination confirmed in adjacent buildings. Multiple exposure cases. Recommend immediate evacuation of all personnel within 500-meter radius." Elena held up her phone, showing the message to Hammond. "Someone with operational knowledge is providing real-time intelligence about this situation. The contamination isn't contained." Hammond glanced at the message, then looked at Elena with new suspicion. "Who sent you that message? How do you have contacts providing classified emergency information?" Elena realized she'd created another problem by revealing her access to operational intelligence networks, but the escalating crisis left no time for careful concealment. "The source doesn't matter. What matters is getting these people to safety before exposure levels become dangerous." Curtis stepped between Elena and the rest of the staff. Everyone return to your desks. This conversation is over. Miss Vasquez, you'll report to Human Resources immediately for disciplinary action. Elena watched her colleagues reluctantly move away from the windows and return to their workstations, their trust in administrative authority overriding their growing concerns about the situation developing outside. She understood their position. Questioning supervisors could destroy careers in federal employment, and most people preferred to trust institutional hierarchies rather than face uncomfortable uncertainties. 5 minutes, Elena said quietly, her eyes fixed on Hammond. Give me 5 minutes to make one phone call that will confirm whether this facility needs evacuation. If I'm wrong, I'll accept whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate. Hammond's smile was coldly triumphant. You've already exceeded your authority multiple times today. The only phone call you'll be making is to explain your insubordination to Human Resources. Elena looked toward the window one last time, watching hazmat teams methodically working through buildings that were supposed to be safe from contamination. Her colleagues sat at their desks, processing routine paperwork while potentially lethal chemicals spread through ventilation systems. They trusted to provide clean air. The choice was becoming clear. Follow bureaucratic protocols that might get people killed, or break ranks entirely and take actions that would end her carefully constructed anonymity forever. Elena was tired of watching qualified decisions being made by unqualified people who valued hierarchy over human safety. Elena's phone exploded with incoming calls and messages as the situation at the medical center reached critical mass. Through the office windows, she watched emergency responders rushing between buildings while more specialized vehicles arrived with equipment she recognized from chemical warfare response protocols. The scene below had evolved from controlled emergency response to full-scale crisis management. A fire alarm suddenly pierced the office air, followed immediately by the building's chemical exposure warning system. The automated voice announcement crackled through speakers. Chemical contamination detected in building's C ventilation system. All personnel report to designated safe areas immediately. Hammond's confident expression cracked as she realized that contamination had indeed spread beyond the medical center. Curtis grabbed her radio, frantically trying to contact building security for clarification, but received only static in response. The communication breakdown indicated system-wide failures that Elena recognized from previous chemical incident. Protocols. The ventilation system is compromised, Elena announced to the increasingly panicked office staff. Everyone needs to move to the stairwells immediately. Stay away from air vents and HVAC returns. David Chun stood up from his desk, his face pale with growing realization. Elena, how do you know about chemical contamination procedures? This isn't normal emergency training. Elena was already moving toward the emergency supplies cabinet, retrieving the basic protective equipment that most federal buildings maintained, but few employees knew how to use properly. She began distributing masks and emergency chemical exposure kits with practiced efficiency that revealed training her colleagues had never received. Wet these masks with the saline solution, Elena instructed, demonstrating the proper application technique. Cover your nose and mouth completely and breathe slowly to minimize exposure. If you start feeling dizzy or nauseous, sit down immediately and raise your hand. Hammond watched Elena's coordinated response with growing suspicion and anger. You're not qualified to distribute emergency equipment or provide medical instructions. Stop interfering with proper emergency protocols. Elena ignored Hammond's protests, focusing on her colleagues who were looking increasingly frightened as the chemical alarms continued blaring. Linda from intake was struggling with her emergency mask, and Elena quickly adjusted the straps to ensure proper coverage. Mike from appeals was hyperventilating with panic, and Elena guided him through breathing exercises that would help him maintain calm during evacuation. The emergency exits are compromised, Elena said after checking her phone for updates from Her intelligence contact. Chemical contamination is highest near the main exits due to wind patterns, pushing vapors from the medical center toward this building. We need to use the north stairwell and exit through the loading dock. Curtis stepped forward aggressively. You don't have authority to change evacuation routes. Building security determines proper exit procedures during emergencies. Elena looked at Curtis with growing frustration. Building security isn't responding to radio calls because they've been evacuated or overcome by chemical exposure. The people who should be making these decisions are either gone or incapacitated. Through the office windows, Elena could see emergency responders setting up a larger perimeter around their building. More concerning, she noticed personnel wearing full chemical protective suits approaching their facility, indicating that contamination levels had reached dangerous thresholds. Requiring specialized protection, Elena's phone rang with a call from a number she recognized immediately. This is Colonel Sandra Mitchell, Fort Detrick Chemical Defense Division. I'm coordinating federal response to the Phoenix incident. Elena, we need your assessment of the building evacuation status. Elena stepped away from her colleagues to take the call, but Hammond followed, clearly listening to the conversation. Colonel Mitchell, we have approximately 30 personnel in Building C who need immediate evacuation. Local administrators are refusing to implement emergency protocols. Elena, the contamination has reached level 3 exposure thresholds. You have maybe 10 minutes before symptoms become severe. Get those people out through the north exit route you identified. Hammond grabbed Elena's arm as she ended the call. Who was that? How do you have direct contact with military chemical defense personnel? What aren't you telling us about your background? Elena looked around at her colleagues who were now staring at her with mixture of confusion and growing understanding. The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 3 years was crumbling in real time, but people's lives hung in the balance. I can explain later, Elena said firmly. Right now, we need to evacuate before the chemical exposure becomes lethal. The building's ventilation system suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that indicated either system failure or deliberate shutdown. Elena recognized the tactical implications immediately. Someone had realized the VAFIC was distributing contaminated air and had cut all airflow to prevent further circulation. Without ventilation, the building would quickly become a sealed container, concentrating whatever chemicals had already entered the system. Elena calculated they had minutes, not hours, before the situation became life-threatening for everyone in the building. Move now, Elena commanded, her voice carrying unmistakable authority. North stairwell, emergency formation, no talking. During evacuation, if anyone starts showing symptoms, we stop and treat them immediately. Hammond made one final attempt to assert control. I'm ordering everyone to remain in place until proper authorities provide evacuation instructions. Elena looked directly at Hammond, her 3 years of careful deference finally abandoned. The proper authorities are telling you to evacuate. I am the proper authority. The moment of truth had arrived, and Elena was done hiding behind a desk. While preventable disasters unfolded around her, preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena straightened her shoulders and pulled off the cardigan she'd worn like armor for 3 years, revealing the small pin on her blouse that no one had ever bothered to examine closely. The insignia showed crossed pistols over a parachute, the distinctive symbol of Army Special Forces, topped by a small metal star that indicated field-grade officer rank. Her colleagues stared in shock as Elena transformed before their eyes from invisible caseworker to military commander. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Elena Vasquez, United States Army Special Forces, Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear Defense Specialist. She announced, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to life and death command decisions. I've been working undercover for the past 3 years investigating irregularities in veteran medical programs. Hammond's face went white as the implications hit her. That's impossible. Your personnel file shows civilian employment history. You've never served in the military. Elena reached into her purse and produced a leather credential holder, flipping it open to reveal a Department of Defense identification card with her photograph, rank, and clearance levels clearly visible. My cover identity was established through official channels. The investigation into this facility has been ongoing since 2021. David Chun stepped backward, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding. The burn pit knowledge, the deployment locations, the medical expertise. You weren't learning from files, you lived it. Elena nodded grimly. I served 4 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan as a chemical officer before transitioning to counterintelligence operations. My specialty is identifying threats to veteran populations and infiltrating organizations that exploit former military personnel. Curtis found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What kind of investigation? What have you been looking for? Elena's expression hardened as she looked around the room at her colleagues, many of whom had unknowingly participated in the system she'd been investigating. Deliberate misclassification of chemical exposure cases, systematic denial of benefits to veterans with classified medical histories, and potential targeting of former special operations personnel through their VA medical records. The chemical alarms continued wailing as Elena spoke, but her words carried more immediate danger than the contamination spreading through the building. Someone has been accessing confidential veteran medical files to identify personnel who participated in classified chemical weapons programs. Today's attack specifically targeted Ward 7B because it houses veterans with unique exposure histories. Hammond grabbed Elena's identification, studying it with growing horror. If this is real, why didn't you identify yourself when the emergency started? We could have evacuated hours ago. Elena retrieved her credentials and returned them to her purse with military precision. Because my investigation isn't complete, and revealing my identity compromises ongoing operations. But I'm not watching people die to protect a cover story. Elena moved to the office supply closet and retrieved a large duffel bag that her colleagues had assumed contained personal items. She unzipped it to reveal sophisticated communication equipment, emergency medical supplies, and chemical detection instruments that belonged in a military command center, not a VI processing office. I've been monitoring potential threats to this facility for 18 months, Elena explained as she activated the communication array. The psychiatric ward houses 12 veterans who were exposed to experimental chemical agents during classified operations. Someone obtained their medical records and developed targeted chemical weapons designed to interact with their previous exposures. Elena's hands moved across the equipment with practiced efficiency, establishing secure communication links with federal response teams while simultaneously analyzing chemical detection data streaming from sensors throughout the complex. Her transformation was complete. The quiet caseworker had vanished, replaced by a special operations officer managing a crisis that required expertise her colleagues couldn't comprehend. Alpha Command, this is Saber 6. Elena spoke into her headset using military radio protocols. Building C evacuation in progress. Request immediate extraction team for contaminated personnel. Chemical signature matches Syrian weapons we encountered. In Operation Desert Falcon. Hammond listened to Elena's radio communications with growing realization of how thoroughly she'd been deceived. Operation Desert Falcon was classified. How do you know about Syrian chemical weapons? Elena looked up from her equipment array, her eyes carrying the weight of classified experiences that explained her 3 years of careful anonymity. Because I was the chemical officer who analyzed those weapons after we captured the production facility. The same compounds are being used here, modified to target specific genetic markers found in veterans who were exposed to our own experimental programs. Curtis stepped closer to Elena's equipment, recognizing sophisticated technology that belonged in military command centers. "How long have you been planning for this? All this equipment, the communication systems, the intelligence contacts." Elena continued coordinating with federal response teams while explaining the scope of her operation. 18 months of preparation. We identified this facility as a potential target after similar attacks on veteran populations in San Diego and Norfolk. Someone is systematically hunting former special operations personnel who possess knowledge of classified chemical weapons programs. Elena stood up from her communication array, her posture and demeanor completely transformed from the hunched, invisible woman who'd processed claims from the corner cubicle. The chemical attack today was designed to eliminate witnesses to military programs that officially never existed. But they made one critical mistake. Hammond stared at Elena with mixture of fear and fascination. What mistake? Elena smiled grimly as she prepared to lead her colleagues to safety. They assumed a Special Forces chemical officer would stay hidden behind a desk instead of fighting back. Elena moved through the contaminated building with the fluid precision of someone trained in hostile environments, her every action demonstrating expertise that left her colleagues speechless. She activated a handheld chemical detector from her equipment cache, sweeping it through the air with systematic patterns that revealed her intimate knowledge of contamination assessment protocols. Chemical signature is consistent with aerosolized VX derivative, modified with targeting proteins, Elena announced into her headset while simultaneously interpreting data streams that her colleagues couldn't begin to understand. Concentration levels indicate release occurred approximately 47 minutes ago from multiple distribution points throughout the psychiatric facility. David Chun watched in amazement as Elena transformed their mundane office space into a tactical command center. She repositioned furniture to create sight lines for monitoring multiple exit routes, established communication protocols with federal response teams, and began coordinating evacuation procedures with military efficiency that revealed years of specialized training. "Elena, how are you reading that equipment?" David asked, staring at the complex chemical analysis display that looked like something from a science fiction movie. "Those readings could be anything." Elena glanced up from the detector, her expression focused but patient. VX compound produces distinctive molecular signatures when combined with atmospheric moisture. The modified targeting proteins create secondary reactions that appear as elevated nitrogen compound readings on spectral analysis. She pointed to specific readings on the device display. These concentration gradients indicate the chemical was delivered through aerosol dispersal systems, probably hidden in maintenance equipment that accessed multiple ventilation networks simultaneously. The attack was coordinated and sophisticated. Curtis stood frozen as Elena demonstrated tactical communication skills that belonged in military command centers, not civilian government offices. "You're coordinating with federal response teams like you outrank them. How do you have that level of authority?" Elena continued managing multiple radio frequencies while explaining the scope of her operational clearance. "My rank and specialized expertise grant me emergency command authority during chemical weapons incidents involving veteran populations. The Pentagon activated those protocols when we confirmed this was a targeted attack." Elena's hands moved across her communication equipment with practiced precision, switching between encrypted channels while simultaneously monitoring chemical detection data and coordinating with hazmat teams approaching their building. Her ability to process multiple information streams while maintaining tactical awareness revealed training that took years to develop. "Extraction Team Alpha, this is Saber 6. Elena spoke into her headset with crisp military protocol. "Building C contains 31 civilian personnel requiring decontamination processing. Priority evacuation for individuals showing early symptoms of organophosphate exposure. Hammond listened to Elena's tactical communications with growing realization of how thoroughly she'd underestimated the quiet woman she'd dismissed for years. Organophosphate exposure? How do you know what specific chemical class we're dealing with? Elena looked up from her equipment array, her eyes reflecting experience with chemical weapons that explained her expertise in recognizing attack patterns. Because I helped develop countermeasures for these specific compounds during classified programs in Syria. The symptoms progression and environmental dispersal patterns are consistent with weapons we encountered during Operation Mercury Shield. Elena began distributing advanced protective equipment from her concealed supplies, demonstrating proper application techniques with the confidence of someone who'd trained others in chemical defense protocols. She showed her colleagues how to properly seal protective masks, apply emergency antidotes, and recognize symptoms of various chemical exposure levels. The emergency injection devices contain atropine and pralidoxime, Elena explained as she distributed auto-injectors to each person. If anyone experiences muscle twitching, excessive salivation, or difficulty breathing, inject immediately into the large muscle of your thigh. Don't hesitate and don't wait for permission. Linda from intake stared at the medical device Elena had placed in her hands. This looks like military equipment. How do you have access to chemical warfare antidotes? Elena was already moving to the next phase of evacuation planning, analyzing exit routes using tactical software on her specialized tablet. Because chemical weapons don't distinguish between military and civilian targets. My job is protecting veteran populations from threats that exploit their service-connected vulnerabilities. Elena activated a portable jamming device that blocked certain radio frequencies while allowing her secure communications to continue uninterrupted. The action revealed her understanding of sophisticated electronic warfare techniques that belonged in special operations environments. Why are you blocking radio signals? David asked, watching Elena manipulate equipment that seemed impossibly advanced for a VA office. Elena continued coordinating with federal response teams while explaining the tactical necessity of her actions. Because the attackers are monitoring emergency response communications to track evacuation progress. They want to know which veterans survived the initial chemical exposure and where they're being relocated for treatment. Elena's transformation was complete as she led her colleagues toward the secured evacuation route, moving with the tactical awareness of someone trained to operate in hostile environments. Her colleagues followed her with newfound respect, finally understanding that the quiet woman they'd dismissed possessed expertise that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The invisible caseworker had vanished forever, replaced by a special operations officer whose 3 years of careful concealment had been sacrificed to save lives that bureaucratic protocols would have lost. Elena led her colleagues through the north stairwell, but halfway down, her chemical detector began screaming with alarms that indicated lethal concentration levels ahead. The evacuation route she'd planned was compromised, blocked by chemical clouds that had concentrated in the lower levels of the building through the ventilation system's natural airflow patterns. Stop, Elena commanded, raising her hand as her team clustered behind her on the stairwell landing. Chemical levels below are approaching LD50 thresholds. We can't proceed without full protective suits. Hammond pushed forward, her panic overriding rational thought. We have to get out. The building is filling with poison gas. Elena grabbed Hammond's arm, preventing her from descending into the contaminated stairwell. LD50 means lethal dose for 50% of exposed personnel. Going down there without proper protection is suicide. Elena activated her tactical communication system, coordinating with federal response teams while analyzing alternative escape routes that required expertise her colleagues couldn't comprehend. Alpha Command, this is Sabre 6. Primary evacuation route compromised. Chemical concentration at basement level indicates possible secondary dispersal device. The response crackled through her headset with information that confirmed Elena's worst fears. Saber 6. Intelligence indicates multiple chemical devices throughout the complex. Primary attack was designed to drive personnel towards secondary exposure points. You're walking into a trap. Elena processed this information while studying building schematics on her tactical tablet, searching for alternative routes that would avoid the carefully planned kill zones. Her colleagues watched with growing terror as Elena's analysis revealed the sophisticated nature of the attack they'd stumbled into. They planned this, Elena said grimly, showing the building layout to David Chun. The initial chemical release was designed to force evacuees towards specific exit points where additional devices were positioned. Standard escape routes become death traps. Curtis stared at the tactical display with growing horror. How do we get out? If all the exits are contaminated, we're trapped. Elena was already formulating an alternative plan that required skills and knowledge her colleagues couldn't provide. There's one route they didn't anticipate because it requires specialized training that most people don't possess. Elena led the group up instead of down, climbing toward the building's roof access. Her colleagues followed reluctantly, confused by the decision to move away from ground-level exits they'd been trained to use during emergencies. The roof? Linda asked breathlessly as they climbed. How does that help us? We'll be trapped up there. Elena reached the roof access door and began working on the electronic lock using specialized tools from her equipment kit. Because extraction teams can reach us by air without risking ground-level contamination. But first, we need to neutralize the threat. On the roof, Elena deployed sophisticated detection equipment that revealed the full scope of the chemical attack. Multiple buildings across the complex showed contamination signatures, indicating a coordinated assault designed to eliminate specific veteran populations while creating maximum chaos. This isn't random terrorism, Elena explained as she coordinated with incoming helicopter support. The attack patterns target facilities housing veterans with specific medical histories. Someone is systematically hunting personnel who possess knowledge of classified chemical weapons programs. Elena's tactical analysis revealed that the attackers had positioned themselves in a nearby building, monitoring the emergency response and prepared to trigger additional chemical devices if their initial attack failed to achieve complete elimination of target personnel. I can see their observation post, Elena said, studying the surrounding area through military-grade binoculars. They're in the insurance building across the street, probably planning to trigger secondary devices once they confirm casualty counts. David Chun looked through the binoculars Elena handed him, but saw only office windows. How do you know they're there? It looks like empty offices. Elena pointed to specific details that revealed tactical positioning invisible to untrained observers. Window configurations have been modified for observation. Electromagnetic signature indicates high-powered communication equipment, and the building's HVAC system has been altered to provide positive pressure protection against their own chemical weapons. Elena made a decision that revealed the full extent of her special operations training. I'm going to neutralize their command post before they can trigger additional devices. Hammond grabbed Elena's arm desperately. You can't leave us here. We don't know how to operate this equipment or coordinate with the rescue teams. Elena looked at her colleagues, recognizing their dependence on expertise they'd dismissed for 3 years. David, you're in command until extraction arrives. Follow the communication protocols I've established and maintain contact with Alpha Command every 5 minutes. Elena prepared for a tactical operation that would require every skill she developed during her military career, knowing that failure would result in mass casualties among the veteran population she'd sworn to protect. Elena rappelled down the side of the building, using tactical rope techniques that left her colleagues stunned on the rooftop. Her descent was silent and controlled, revealing specialized training in urban assault operations that belonged in elite military units, not civilian government offices. Within minutes, she had infiltrated the insurance building and begun neutralizing the terrorist command post with precision that spoke to years of special operations experience. Through her tactical communication system, David Chun and the others listened as Elena systematically disabled the chemical weapons network. Her calm professional updates, providing real-time intelligence to federal response teams, coordinating the broader counter-terrorism operation. Command post neutralized. Elena's voice crackled through the radio. 4 hostiles detained, chemical dispersal devices disarmed. Beginning intelligence recovery on targeting protocols and veteran identification systems. 20 minutes later, Elena emerged from the insurance building, escorted by a full tactical team wearing insignia that Hammond recognized as Army Special Forces. The lead operator, a muscular sergeant with multiple combat deployment ribbons, approached Elena with obvious deference and respect. "Outstanding work, Colonel," the sergeant said, snapping to attention. "Intelligence recovery indicates this was part of a coordinated operation targeting 12 VA facilities nationwide. Your infiltration and early warning prevented what could have been catastrophic casualties." Elena nodded professionally, but her attention immediately returned to her colleagues still positioned on the rooftop. "Sergeant Martinez, priority extraction for civilian personnel. Some may have trace chemical exposure requiring immediate medical evaluation." As helicopter extraction teams carefully evacuated Elena's colleagues, Hammond found herself face to face with the woman she'd dismissed and undermined for 3 years. Elena stood in full tactical gear, coordinating with federal authorities while managing a counter-terrorism operation that had saved hundreds of lives. "Colonel Vasquez," Hammond said, the title feeling strange after years of calling her a simple caseworker. "I need to understand what just happened. How long have you been investigating our facility?" Elena removed her tactical helmet, her dark hair slightly disheveled, but her bearing unmistakably military. 18 months of deep cover investigation. We identified systematic targeting of special operations veterans through compromised VA medical records. Your facility was processing claims for personnel who possessed knowledge of classified chemical weapons programs. Curtis approached hesitantly, her usual administrative confidence completely shattered. The Morrison case, the Torres cardiac incident, all those detailed medical insights. You weren't just processing claims. You were protecting those veterans. Elena's expression softened slightly as she recognized her colleague's genuine confusion and growing understanding. Every case one handled involved veterans who had participated in classified programs. Someone was using their medical records to identify targets for assassination. David Chun was helped down from the helicopter evacuation, still wearing the emergency chemical protection gear Elena had provided. "You saved us," he said simply. "All of us, not just today, but for months. Those cases you processed so carefully, the medical insights you provided. You were protecting people we didn't even know were in danger." Elena nodded, her 3 years of careful concealment finally justified by the successful completion of her mission. The investigation identified a network of foreign operatives who had infiltrated multiple VA facilities. They were systematically eliminating veterans who could testify about chemical weapons programs that officially never existed. Colonel Sandra Mitchell arrived by military helicopter, her uniform bearing the insignia of Army Chemical Defense Command. She approached Elena with obvious professional respect, carrying documentation that would restore Elena's official status and end her undercover assignment. "Colonel Vasquez, on behalf of the Secretary of Defense, I'm authorized to inform you that your investigation has been completed successfully," Mitchell announced formally. "Your cover assignment is terminated, and you're hereby restored to active duty status with full rank and privileges." Elena accepted the orders with military bearing, but her eyes remained on her former colleagues, who were watching this transformation with amazement. Hammond stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and newfound respect. "Colonel, I owe you an apology," Hammond said, struggling with words that couldn't adequately address 3 years of dismissive treatment. "We had no idea who you were or what you were protecting us from." Elena looked around at her colleagues, recognizing their genuine remorse and growing understanding of the sacrifice she'd made to protect them. "You treated me exactly as my cover identity required. A successful infiltration depends on being overlooked and underestimated." Curtis approached with tears in her eyes. "You could have revealed yourself earlier. You could have stopped the attacks before they reached our building." Elena's expression was gentle but firm. "Revealing my identity would have compromised the broader investigation and allowed the terrorist network to escape. Sometimes protection requires sacrifice." As federal agents began processing the scene and debriefing personnel, Elena stood with her colleagues one final time. The invisible caseworker had vanished forever, replaced by the special operations officer she'd always been. Her 3 years of exile were complete, and Colonel Elena Vasquez was ready to return to the light. 6 months later, Colonel Elena Vasquez stood in the Pentagon briefing room, addressing a gathering of senior military officials and intelligence personnel. Her presentation detailed the successful dismantling of the terrorist network that had targeted American veterans, resulting in congressional medals for her team and policy changes, protecting classified medical records. After the briefing, Elena walked through the corridors where her photograph now hung among distinguished special operations officers. Her 3 years of invisibility had become a case study taught at military intelligence schools, demonstrating the power of patient infiltration and sacrifice for mission success. Her phone buzzed with a text message from David Chun, now promoted to senior case manager at the Phoenix VA. "Colonel, the Morrison case was approved today. Full disability rating with back pay. Thought you'd want to know your fight for him succeeded." Elena smiled, remembering the homeless Marine whose case had been one of many she'd quietly advocated for during her undercover assignment. Her work behind that corner desk had saved more lives than anyone realized, protecting vulnerable veterans while building the intelligence network that ultimately stopped a nationwide terrorist campaign. Director Hammond had submitted a formal letter of recommendation detailing Elena's exceptional performance during her cover assignment, noting that her dedication to veteran welfare had been evident even when her true identity remained hidden. The woman who had dismissed Elena for 3 years now spoke of her with profound respect and admiration. Elena looked out the Pentagon window toward the Virginia skyline, knowing that somewhere in offices and facilities across the country, other undercover operatives maintained their own careful anonymity, protecting people who would never know their names or understand their sacrifices. What did you think of Elena's incredible transformation? Stories like this remind us that heroes often work in shadows, their greatest victories invisible to those they protect. If you enjoyed this inspiring story of courage, sacrifice, and ultimate redemption, smash that subscribe button and join our community of viewers who love real stories of extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. What story should we tell next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. We love hearing from our amazing subscribers. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring content.